Welcome to The Man in the Tombs, a story of victory over mental illness and addiction through the love of Christ, as narrated by Pete Caputo. Please be advised that this story contains graphic and violent accounts that are not suitable for younger audiences. Chapter 1. What Painful Scars We Bear. Driving down routes 1 and 9 towards Jersey City, New Jersey, my mind strolls behind the fabric of yesteryear as the stadium where I ran track as a 13-year-old comes into view. I was a member of the 220-yard relay team, and although not born with the natural abilities sported by many other competitors, I had in my possession a volatile fuel that made me a force to be reckoned with: hate. I would single out one individual and create a long list of brutalities that he had committed against my mother and me, believing if I were to beat him, justice would be served. I then ran as if my life depended on it to set myself free from the realities that were otherwise beyond my control. And I was able to stay afloat, at least for a while, until the burden of housing each such lethal emotion escalated, and the means of escape took turns that caused me to pay a dear price. Escape was bittersweet and never came without a cost, but its momentary pleasure was one I was willing to pay for. It made me feel like I was someone special, not a worthless individual as I was made to believe. I stepped into life's starting block broken and wounded, and at the sound of the gun, a healing began to take place as stride after stride that injured spirit was transformed into a winner. The source of my hate, which seethed in me for 56 long years, was my father. He brought me an unbearable amount of sadness. The depth of my desolation is captured in a memory I have of sitting in school dreaming I had died. The mourners were always men, and when they passed my coffin crying, I wanted them to feel a misery and longed to be able to turn back time so they could rescue me from the suffering that brought me to this state. Reflecting on it now, perhaps, the men were a symbol of my father, responding as I wished he would if he knew how much he was hurting me. But if they were my father, this was a dream with no chance of coming true, because even if I had died, I doubt if he would have shed a single tear. That's the kind of man he was, the type of relationship we had. There was no love between us, just a lot of hurt, which left an indelible mark on my life from the very beginning. His name was Frederick William Valentine, a tall, blonde, blue-eyed ladies' man who managed the food market where 19-year-old Susan Connolly, my mother, worked as a cashier. One day, after agreeing to go out with him, he became incensed by her refusal to drink and began pouring liquor down her throat. One thing led to another, and he forced himself upon her in the backseat of his car. Hours later, she wound up in the backyard of her parents' house, crying and bleeding. 9 months later, on July 5th, 1943, I was born. My mother and I stayed with my grandparents in a room on the second floor of their large home. 24 people were living in the house at the same time, as we were in the thick of World War II, and it was customary for our families to come together while the men were serving the country. We were a close-knit Irish family with a Roman Catholic background. To the eyes of those who knew us from a distance, we were warm and full of love, but behind the floral curtains and charming arrangements of 8x10s were walls that had seen the dark past, a living nightmare that paralyzed the children under that roof. The cause of their horror was my grandfather, a violent alcoholic who inflicted unspeakable abuses upon my mother and her siblings as he staggered through his growing sickness. Ruling the house with an iron hand, he removed them from school at an early age and made them find employment. They were beaten mercilessly, locked in closets, and violated with the greatest inhumanity as he forced them to perform sexual acts with each other while he watched. The children hated him for what he did and left home at the first opportunity, unfortunately with their lives severely damaged. My Aunt Charlotte became mentally disturbed and, according to my mom, at the age of 20, committed suicide by shoving a broken soda bottle up her reproductive area. Another became so sexually promiscuous that she was like a creeping poison, bringing the kiss of death to many marriages in the family. My mother battled with depression, survived a suicide attempt, and became dependent on the attention and approval of others. It was this weakness that made her vulnerable to the advances of my father, desperately hoping he would be the knight who would rescue her from this cruel world. This was the backdrop of my infancy, yet my eyes were shielded from it by the perfect picture of love painted by the women in my life, my mother, my 2 aunts, and my grandmother. They showed me a great deal of attention, especially Grandma. She simply adored me and did things for me that she never did for any of the other grandchildren. How I wished everything could have stayed as it was, even with its flaws, but I guess it was inevitable that it would change. That's just the way life is. Like the boogeyman who comes in the night and shatters a child's dreams. I guess my boogeyman was destined to make his appearance too. Shortly before I was born, my father entered the military to run away from what happened. He became a master sergeant assigned as a weapons instructor for the Army. When on leave, he began coming around to see my mother, always full of apologies, blaming his drunkenness for his unacceptable behavior. My grandmother took a position of forgiveness and proceeded to push her into marrying him, claiming it was so I could have his last name. For some reason, though, I can't help believing it was to get her away from my grandfather. Nonetheless, she persisted, and Mom eventually gave in. Within 3 short months, they were joined in wedlock. Since Dad was in the military, Mom and I were thrown into a life with no roots, having to relocate each time he was reassigned. We were like captives with no real life of our own, but Mom didn't seem to mind so much. He was the center of her world, and she did everything she could to please him. The problem was she was not the center of his, and the affection she freely gave was rarely reciprocated. Dad did a lot of drinking and even entertained other women. I don't know if he really loved my mother. His actions gave every indication that he did not. They did, however, frequently go out dancing and to stock car races, but the good times always ended when they got home. That's where reality set in, because that's where I was, the constant reminder that he had raped her. He made every attempt to free himself from this guilt, repeatedly going through the court system with the help of his mother to try and prove I was not his child. I was too young to understand all the implications of this, but I know it had to be heartbreaking for my mom to see her husband make such vile accusations against her character. Yet she took it all in stride, wanting so much for things to work out. For this reason, she kept herself looking attractive and put tremendous effort into keeping their intimacy alive. Within the tumult of these delicate times, my brother Freddie was born. Although I was the oldest, he was the one named after my father. He was Frederick William Valentine Jr., Dad's spinning image. Tommy was born 3 years later while we were living in a cold water flat in Joplin, Missouri, a few houses away from some railroad tracks. During our stay in Joplin, I was bubbling with curiosity. I recall a time when I was watching my father smoke and decided to ask him how it worked. With a smile on his face, he lit both ends of a cigarette and handed it to me, as if to say, "So you want to smoke, huh? Smoke this." Of course, I was smart enough not to put it in my mouth, but I was confused. I walked away thinking it was just his way of deterring me from picking up the habit in the future, which was far from the truth. In actuality, it was his way of telling me how much he despised me. As much as my interaction with Dad revealed the extent of his hate, Mom's showed the extent of her love. For example, I had a habit of sneaking out of the house to play beneath the oil tankers. One day, she discovered I was missing. She frantically came searching for me and quickly scooped me up in her arms before something tragic happened. I was too young then to realize the danger I was in or the emotional changes I was taking her through. If only I had a clue, I would have been the perfect child, because hidden from my eyes was a woman slowly unraveling beneath the burden of shouldering a one-sided marriage. Mom was going through a lot of anguish, and little did I know that it would soon begin to take its toll. There were 2 incidences that brought me to this rude awakening. The first took place when I was 4. We had moved back to New Jersey into a 2-bedroom flat in Newark Avenue in Jersey City. Shortly after our arrival, my Aunt Dottie Her husband and 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, all under 6 years of age, moved in with us. My parents slept in one room. Aunt Dottie and Uncle Harold slept in a couch in the other room. And Freddie, Tommy, our cousins, and I shared the second bedroom. To me, this was a great situation. I was surrounded by boys my own age and always had something exciting to do. When I look back on it, however, these had to be extremely stressful times for my mother. Compounding the pressure she was already under, it was clearly showed one evening at the dinner table. Freddie, who was known for his risky behavior, was sitting beside her playing with his food. She told him several times to stop, but he didn't do it. In a burst of anger, she grabbed her fork and stabbed him in the top of his head. I can't remember if there was any blood. I just recall the chaos it caused as he jumped up screaming and ran away from the table. I was scared. This was totally out of character for my mom. All my life I had seen her as this sweet, loving person, always the victim, never the aggressor. But anger surfaced that evening in a raging torment that could have seriously injured the child she dearly loved. The second most horrifying incident occurred shortly afterwards. Out of nowhere, this beautiful woman attempted to jump off a bridge with my brothers and me and drown us in the muddy depths of the Passaic River. Fortunately, she was stopped by the police before our midday stroll turned tragic.